But having said that, it is also true that Hinduism and Buddhism share a lot of teachings in common. In fact, in some ways, if you contrast and compare some of the schools, there is a lot perhaps more common between some traditions of Hinduism and some traditions of Buddhism than even between or among some of the orthodox traditions of Hinduism. So Buddhism, as you quite rightly said, came out of the larger Hindu ground, and therefore has many teachings in common with the Hindu tradition. And in contemporary times, there are very good relationships between Hindus and Buddhists. I do not think that the fact that the Buddha doesn't recognize the authority of the Veda is a stumbling block today to dialogue and conversation between Hindus and Buddhists. And I think that if you offered your invitation in the sense or in the larger context of sharing wisdom between these two traditions and the sharing wisdom through the exploration of texts, I think this would be that kind of approach would be well received. And I would suggest that the appropriate text to look at from the Hindu perspective would be some passages from the Upanishads. Because with certain traditions of Buddhism, the teaching of Buddha Natya, I'm using this only as an example. First of all, the teaching about non-duality, that reality is not two, and secondly, the whole teaching that Buddha Natya, everything has Buddha Natya. Buddha Natya is the fundamental truth of all things. I think teachings like these will connect very deeply with certain traditions in Hinduism, and a very fertile area for dialogue. Yes, there is the issue of scripture and its authority, and that itself might be worthy of very good dialogue. Annie, is that helpful? Okay, thank you very much. Thanks. Now we come to Peter's question.
Yeah, nice, Peter.
Yes, hi, Peter.
Hi, Anand. My question was prompted by three factors. First of all, during your opening remark, let me put it that way, you didn't touch much about the concept of God.
No.
And secondly, And secondly, it's prompted by the fact of this trajectory, the concept of God in interreligious relationship, and the role of leadership, religious leadership, and because factors that make a host of conundrums in the interreligious relationship, but the concept of God is one of them. And so I wanted you to say something about that concept so that we could be informed on how, just like Ayo's question came from her direction, mine is about the concept of God, and this will enlighten us to see how we can approach the order on this topic.
So, Peter, I'm going to make a few points, and maybe everyone can note these. And if you want me to pursue any one of these in particular, I will be happy to do that. Keep in mind also, in what I'm about to say, I'm speaking more broadly about the Hindu tradition. Particular theological traditions would have, their own distinctive flavor and their own distinctive emphases on all that I would say. So let me begin to say that the Hindu tradition, and here I'm drawing particularly from the Vedas, and more specifically from the final section of the Vedas, the wisdom section of the Vedas, or the Upanishads. And what we see in the Upanishads is that a very deep emphasis on God as self-existent. The existence of God before all things is a very fundamental starting point in the teachings of the Upanishads. We have many passages that speak to this. Passages that say, for example, in the beginning, it was God alone. There was nothing else that winked. And this is a God as the self-existent reality before anything else came into being is a fundamental starting point in the Hindu tradition. One Upanishad puts it very beautifully, and the teacher says, there are some who say that in the beginning there was nothing, and from nothing this universe arose. And then the teacher says, but how could that be? How could something be born of nothing? In the beginning there was God alone, one without a second. And this, I should mention also that the Sanskrit term that is used for God in the Upanishads is Brahman. Brahman means the limitless or the infinite. And the second point I would make about that is very fundamental to Hindu understandings about God is that Hinduism does not subscribe to a dualism which sort of suggests some pre-existent matter out of which God creates. So God does not create the universe or bring forth the universe out of any matter existing separate and distinct from God. But also, the Hindu traditions do not teach that God created the world out of nothing. The general Hindu teaching is that God brings forth the universe out of God's self, the infinite God, and this is important, without any loss of nature, brings forth the universe out of God's self. So what we have is creation coming out of the divine. But God also is always more than the created world. God always transcends the created world while remaining the sole cause of everything. The third point I want to make, Peter, therefore, the universe is always represented in the Hindu tradition as existing in God. God is not just thought of as a supernatural being dwelling apart from the universe, separate from the universe. The universe is consistently described as existing in God, even as God exists equally in everything. So there are many, many scriptural texts on this point about everything in God and God existing equally in everything. So there's a strong emphasis on the immanence of the divine reality in everything. And at the same time, while God is in everything and everything is in God, God transcends everything. So Hinduism should not be, it is commonly misunderstood and represented as pantheism, a sort of a simple equation of God with the world, but I think that's a very simplistic representation of the Hindu tradition. There's a clear sense of both immanence and transcendence in the Hindu tradition, and a lot of scriptural passages that we could point out. The next point I would want to say, Peter, and this is one that is very often confusing because of the multiple names and forms for God in the Hindu tradition, which is a part of the diversity of the Hindu world. But I do want to emphasize that in spite of many names and many forms, I think Hindus on the whole understand God to be one. It is not a simple polytheism. Certainly the infinite God has infinite names, and the infinite God can be thought of in infinite names. But God transcends all names and all forms, and God is ultimately what not two. No single name can define, no single name can contain or limit the divine. I also want to add, Peter, that there is a very important concept in the Hindu tradition. While God's names and God's forms are many, we all have to choose one name and form to which we are committed and which is the focus of our understanding of God. We have the idea in Hinduism of the Ishta Deva. This is among the many names and forms of God. Which one do you choose? Which one has special meaning and which one has special significance for you? So most Hindus will be able to say you know, my Ishtadeva is Shiva, my Ishtadeva is Vishnu, my Ishtadeva is the feminine form of God, it is Durga or Shakti. So the Ishtadeva idea is very important for us. I think finally, I'm saying perhaps too much, Peter, in response to your question. I want to also say a quick word, because this is often a problematic issue for people of other traditions. And a lot of Hindu worship is centered on the use of icons. In Sanskrit, we speak of these icons as murtis. And these are very, very special forms of God which are present in Hindu temples. In fact, if you visit a Hindu temple in the central altar space of the temple, you will see an icon or a murti. There's a lot more I can say about that, but I do want to say that one has to be very careful in applying or thinking of idolatry when one thinks of Hindu murtis or Hindu icons. This is not. I don't think idolatry at all is the appropriate word to be used here, because this is a far richer and a more complex way of thinking and worshiping God than the word idolatry might suggest. I hope that I have answered the kind of question that you were asking me, Peter, but I'm happy to follow up if you wish me to.
Can you just follow up on this last point, why it's richer than idolatry and why the word idolatry doesn't describe the worship of murtis?
Okay, Alan. Let me say this, and maybe we can, and you can talk a little bit about it. Idolatry is, as I understand it, is and I agree it's wrong also, it's identification of the infinite with a finite form. In other words, thinking that a particular finite form is the form of God. So worshipping the finite as though it's infinite is really what idolatry is. I think we're getting back that echo, so there must be something on that computer that needs to be adjusted again as we did just now. Great, thank you. In the case of the Hindu tradition, there is a deep understanding of the infinity of God, a deep understanding of the transcendence of God, a deep understanding that God cannot be limited to any particular finite form. And yet a particular form can become the special place, the special location where the infinite God is worshipped. So in Hindu temples, the icons or the murtis that are installed in the sanctum sanctorium of the Hindu temples undergo a very special ritual process in which the infinity of the divine is acknowledged, but the divine is invited and the divine responds as an act of compassion to receive human worship in this particular place and in the particular time when the ritual is performed. But underlying it all, I would say and emphasize, there's a clear sense of divine transcendence and the infinity of the divine. So that's why I'm saying that the word idolatry is not appropriate to describe this worship. Yes, Peter, go ahead.
Thank you very much. And I was impressed with clear and sharp distinction you made between pantheism and the Christian panentheism, and which makes the concept of God as understood in Hinduism and Christianity to be the same. Now, with the two roles of leadership in Hinduism that you described, the Pujari and the Guru, and I mean, with respect to those, I would like to ask, can an individual member of this community access God personally and directly without as a matter of condition going through any of these categories of leadership, especially the Pujari? In other words, like in Christianity, where one may not always have to go to religious leadership to access or to speak with God. Can the person individually do that? personally do that?
Peter, the answer is yes. The answer is yes. While we have the ritual specialists who perform rituals, the ritual specialist is not an intermediary in the sense in which that word is often used. In other words, he or she, his or her presence is not necessary in the tradition for the individual to come to know God and to have a relationship with God. Certainly, the teaching of the tradition is very important. The teaching helps us to understand. The teaching helps us to understand God. The teaching reveals God to us. But the Hindu tradition is not, and this is part of the fact that it is not a centralized tradition. It does not limit the availability of God to certain intermediaries or to certain kinds of people who hold very special priestly or other kinds of positions in the tradition. God is infinite. God is present everywhere. God is present in everyone, and everyone has equal access to the divine. Recognizing, of course, that we have a scripture that helps us understand deeply the nature of God.
Hi, Anand.
Hi.
I'd like to go back, if I may, because I think there were some issues in the issue of the icon that I maybe didn't understand.
Yes.
And I feel like I should also preface. Everybody gives a preface. I should preface by saying that I expect that you often spend a lot of your educational time trying to explain to people like me just how the icons operate. And so I apologize for putting you through it again. For me, it's an important process. I'll have to decide whether to visit the temple myself, and just in terms of how exactly to understand this religion with regard to my own faith.
I appreciate that. Yeah.
You explained, as far as I understood, that the icon is a mode by which we represent the fact that God can be accessed in a particular place. My question is, I'm familiar with the sacred nature of space. That's something that my culture has very strongly. I guess what I'm not understanding is the necessity of the icon as an image of that particular form of God. What is the centrality of that image in terms of sanctifying the space around it, meaning that making that temple a place where God can be worshipped?
Okay, very good, and I appreciate your question, and I'm very happy. I appreciate the honesty also of your question and your struggle with icons and iconography. Coming from a tradition, as you said, which is in many ways deeply suspicious about the imaging of the divine. So let me make one preliminary point, which is to say that Hindus are not, as a large tradition, we are not obligated to use icons or to worship God with the aid of icons. And there are many traditions in Hinduism that do not use icons. But for those traditions that do, here is what happens. So these icons are fashioned and they are made following very, very specific traditional guidelines. There are specific texts that describe, the making of an icon, the material to be used, the size, what is to be there, all of the articles and objects that are to be used. Now, when the icon is made, keeping in mind the general Hindu theological position that God is present in everything and in everywhere, God is not limited by time, and God is not limited by space. The icon then goes through a very special ritual ceremony. And at the heart of this ritual ceremony is a prayer to God to be present, I would have to add, in a very special way. Even though you are present everywhere, but we ask you to be present in a very special way in this form. in this temple as an act of grace, so that to receive our worship, as a place where we offer our prayer, as a place that we make our offerings, knowing, in fact, there are some even apologetic prayers that are recited, saying, we know you are everywhere, and yet we have a need to worship you in a particular place. We know you are formless, and yet we crave for a particular form to worship you as God. So the icon, therefore, if you think of it, metaphorically, it's like the sun shines everywhere, and if you have a sort of a magnifying glass, the heat is concentrated in a particular place. So Hindus go to these murtis, we call them, and they go with a deep sense that through grace God has made God's self.
Your microphone, your phone may have just gone out. The battery's gone. I can't hear you anymore.
You see, Anand, God may be everywhere, but we need batteries. Oh, the void space.
Hello? Hello?
Yeah, you're there.
Yeah,
we can hear you.
I think I'm using two phones, and they seem to be battery only going for so long, so I have to keep charging one of them. Sorry, I don't. You heard everything most of what I said?
I think that I heard most of what you said. You had finished by discussing the idea of the magnifying glass.
Yes.
One being kind of focusing the light into one place. That was sort of the last major point that I remember.
Yeah, that's correct. That's the last thing that I said. So, it's not in other words, what I'm trying to say is that I know there's some traditions, and I understand, I share, the concerns of any kind of simple equation of the infinite with the finite. I think it's that. But I just wanted to say that what is happening in the Hindu tradition and worship and in its iconography, something that is not a simple idolatry that may have indeed been present in certain kinds of cultures at certain historical moments.
Can I ask about individual icons? Do they? Is there an idea? I may be responding to popular culture. I have the feeling like there might be a particular icon in a particular temple that is thought to have great power, or a particular focusing of the energies of God in a particular icon or a particular place. Is that a true impression, or is that something that sort of I picked up along the way?
Well, I think you're right. I think that people, I would put it in this way, devotees or worshippers of a particular form of God in a particular place, they may have had certain kinds of experiences, and out of these experiences, they make larger claims about the power or the potency of a specific form of God, be it, form of God as Vishnu, or form of God Shiva, or form of God as Durga or Ganesha with special with special powers. But the thing is that, you know, everyone makes such claims for his or her own form of favorite form of God, on the basis of his or her own experiences. But the general point to keep in mind is that for Hindus who engage in this kind of worship, they find it to be spiritually and religiously meaningful. God can be worshipped at any time, in any place, but perhaps it's more a reflection of our own human limits that we find meaningful also to have special sacred places, and in our case, special sacred forms in which we have a very special experience and encounter with God.
Thank you very much. I'm ready.
Yes. Thank you for your question.
Okay. I feel like the answer is sorry. Okay.
Hi.
It is. Hi, I'm Rivka. Hi. Alon asked me to tell you a story that I told him, and I guess see how you react to it.
Okay.
Regarding an interaction with, actually not my personal interaction with someone Hindu, but a story that I was told myself. So this is, again, a little bit, it could be, I'm not sure how accurate it is even myself, but a friend of mine who's Muslim told me a story. So this is, it's important also that she, I think, is Muslim, is relevant, but she told me a story, basically in short, where she was somewhere visiting a friend and doing some cleaning. She picked up something, was dusting under it, and someone else walked into the room that she didn't know, who was Hindu, and said, "What are you doing? You're picking up my God. You know, how could you hold my God?" Which was in this, I guess it was like some sort of icon that she had picked up, not knowing that it had any religious significance. And I guess she herself, as a Muslim, didn't even, it was very hard for her to even understand the conversation. So anyway, her interpretation was at least that this person thought that the God was in the stone or in the icon. So, which seems a little bit different than what you've been saying in terms of God. So I guess that's the story.
Well, you know, okay, so obviously we are dealing here with a home situation and with the icon of a family or the icon of a particular person. And like I'm sure, you know, in all of the traditions, let's take the Jewish tradition, for example, you know, you can think larger of sacred objects that, you know, we always handle in a very special, sacred and reverential and also even ritualistic kinds of ways. So perhaps this Hindu was reacting, you know, to the fact that, you know, even as we might treat our scriptures, you know, we handle it in a ritual way. We don't put the scriptures at our feet. We place them on our heads and all of that. A sense that somehow the ritual object or the sacred icon was not being handled in the proper manner, and she was reacting to this without necessarily being malicious or anything in her response. But certainly the belief, if it was a properly consecrated icon, it's also, she was obviously thinking that, as I said in response to my last question, that this is a form in which God has graciously made God's self accessible and available for my worship. Keeping in mind, you know, the general Hindu belief is that the infinite God is present everywhere and in everything, and everything is in God, so that any form can become the place where we recognize God, and certain kinds of forms can do that in very powerful ways for us. This is probably part of our human limitation, as I said.
So would you say that Hindu who said that, was she speaking, would you think metaphorically, or was she mistaken? What do you, or just maybe it was misunderstood?
I think if there was a conversation that developed about it, I think she would have offered a richer explanation of what the icon means to her. She would talk about the fact that God is everywhere. If you ask, and maybe you can, whenever you meet a Hindu, you can ask, where is God? And every Hindu would say, what? God is everywhere. God is infinite. And at the same time, the Hindu will also be worshiping God in particular forms, in particular places. So in other words, the worship of God in a particular form and in a particular place is never seen as contrary also to the affirmation of God's presence everywhere and at all times. Once one does not literally misunderstand and mistake the infinite for the finite and limit the infinite to a particular form and a particular name, then it's not problematic for the Hindu. If one worships God in a particular form, knowing that ultimately God is beyond all forms, then that worship is not seen as problematic or contrary to the essence of the tradition. Do you follow me?
I just have one final question, which is, I was wondering about, is the conversion process to Hinduism, is there?
Hinduism does not have, traditionally, Hinduism does not have a formal method of converting people. Still, largely, let me make my answer a little richer for you. So most Hindus who are Hindus today are Hindus who have been born into the tradition. So they are Hindus by the fact of being born into a Hindu family with Hindu parents. That's something that will be familiar to those of you who are Jews, for Jewish ancestry in this class. At the same time, there are some contemporary Hindu movements, perhaps there are contemporary Jewish movements also, and these are quite new movements who have developed certain kinds of ceremonies of people who want to sort of formally enter into the Hindu tradition. But these are very recent and smaller types of organizations. By and large, if one would have to say that if you want to become Hindu, you would have to just live a Hindu life. Because, of course, connected to all that I said before, this is not a structured or organized tradition as well. Hindu identity, membership in an organization, whether it's like a church type of organization, was never a mark of Hindu identity or a requirement of Hindu identity. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Hi, Alon.
Hello, Anand. My name is Alon.
I think
you said something about the ceremony in which the icon, murti, is consecrated through acknowledgement of the infinity of the divine and a request that the divine concentrate itself in this particular image. I understand primarily image and consequently temple. That is to say, the temple is holy because of the image, so therefore the consecration, right? The consecration of the image. Is there a special ceremony? This is in parentheses. Is there a special ceremony for consecrating a temple, or basically the temple is consecrated simply by virtue of the image?
The temple, because the temple, Alon, you're quite right in your intuition about this. The temple is understood to be in the Hindu tradition as the home of the divine, the house of God. This is literally translated. The temple is the house of God, and therefore the temple is consecrated when the icon is consecrated.
Okay, so I may have just argued against myself, but here's the point I'd like to put forward. It goes back to a text in the Book of Kings, where Solomon consecrates the temple, the Jerusalem temple, and his consecration prayer. His consecration prayer offers as its theological framework the recognition that God is omnipresent. All of the heavens cannot contain him. let alone this particular house that Solomon has just finished creating for God. Nevertheless, he asked for God to make this a place where prayers will be received, which means thematically, probably the archetype of sacred space in Judaism, and I imagine by extension also Christianity, even though that's a little bit more complicated than the notion of sacred space and how it operates, is drawn from premises that are very similar to the ones that you just described. Now, in view of that,
I found this a very, very, very interesting text. Yes.
So now I want to extend this to a possible understanding of the role of the image that might make it easier for Haggai and other students to understand what's going on, and to suggest that rather than thinking of the image as an image of God, to think of the image as a temporary abode of the divine. To think of the image as a form of a temple. Now, I might have argued against myself by saying that the temple is the home, but if really the core manifestation is in the image and the building around it is only by extension, really the use of image should not be compared to trying to provide God with a form as much as it is to making a temple for God, and therefore the analogy should be thought of precisely in terms of sacred space rather than along the dynamics of form and formlessness in relation to the divine. So I'm curious to know how you would respond to such a possibility.
Well, that's a very interesting angle. First of all, I am very intrigued by the text that you just shared with me about this prayer for the infinite God to be available in a particular space. I am thinking that your question has interesting implications because if I think of it in the widest way, I would say that you can have an icon or a murti without necessarily having an enclosed space in which this murti is kept. So then in that sense, the murti is the temple, because they are murtis that are not sort of housed necessarily in temples. So if you have the ideas, you articulated it, and I need to think about it a little more clearly, a rich issue for dialogue, that the infinite God, God who is present everywhere in space and time, can also be worshipped in a very specific way, or can be very specially present, in your case, in a temple. Then I would want to think that the same is what is happening with the murti in the Hindu tradition, which would take the discussion, as you quite rightly said, into a different place. So I have to flag this thought, Alon. It's also an interesting one for clarification about what exactly is the relationship between murti and temple. I think what you're asking me to think more about is the relationship between murti and temple.
No, also between murti and infinite God. Yeah, you're right. Yes. The two questions. It's murti and temple, yes, but also murti and God. Okay.
Murti and infinite God, yes.
So this is Alon again with another question. Sometimes conference calls go like that. People see the most obvious things. So going back to Haggai's question of special images and how they function in the cultures, things of special potency, I'd like to share a fact that I think will be relevant for the students and lead into a question that I've been struggling with and I haven't found, I don't know the answer to. As a consequence of the dwelling process that you just described in the consecration of the image, there is also an undoing of the power of the image. And the temporariness, and therefore, from my perspective, the templeness of the image is accentuated in the fact that the normal life cycle or the official life cycle of an image is always circumscribed by procedures where it begins by the consecration, it has a certain life cycle, but then at a certain point its career reaches the end and it is carried to the river where it is, or the ocean, or to a body of water, where it somehow returns back to its cosmic properties, and it's officially recognized that the divine no longer dwells in that particular space, thereby affirming the temporary nature of this and avoiding the possible interpretation of the identification of the infinite in the finite. I think this particular fact is very important in recognizing that how this works, and therefore point to the consciousness of Hindu tradition in recognizing the transitoriness and, from my perspective, the templeness of the image, but food for further thought. So this, I see some nods in the room, so I realize that I brought a piece of information that I picked up along the way that's relevant for the discussion. But that actually leads me to a question that I'd be grateful if you could provide an answer to. Some of the great famous temples in India keep their murtis as permanent fixtures that do not undergo the cycle of temporariness. Let's just take the one temple that got Jews into trouble, which is a temple in Tirupati, where women were cutting their hair. It served for wig-making industry. At a certain point, rabbis in 2004 decided that was benefiting from idolatry, and that led to mass wig-burning ceremonies on streets, which in turn gave an interesting twist to Hindu-Jewish relations and problematizing them as a consequence of the notion of idolatry. Now, the image, I take this as one, but it can be multiplied to probably several hundred major, maybe not thousands, but probably several hundred major, but maybe it's even in the thousands, maybe in the tens of thousands. I don't know the statistics. And you can tell us what happens in the home image, whether the home image is subject to the same cycle. But just to take this example, the image of Balaji in Tirupati has probably been there since Ramanuja consecrated the temple in the 11th century. I don't think nobody's done anything with it, right? So how do you argue for temporariness for a permanent murti? So the question is so really it's a threefold question. The core question is, as I framed it now, temporariness versus fixity. The second question is, how extensive is this phenomenon in the Hindu landscape? That is to say, is it true how one portrays it, that Hindu images ultimately end up in the river, or is this only a half-truth? And third, what happens to the household idols? Do they also undergo a similar procedure?
Very good question, Alan. So good. I mean, you've brought in an important dimension to our thinking about icons and iconography and murtis. So let's take the temple murti, as you gave a very good example, the temple in Tirupati where there is a murti of Vishnu. It's a Vishnu temple. So this murti will undergo this special ritual of consecration. In Sanskrit it's called prana pratishtha, where the divine is invited to be specially present for worship. Generally speaking, in the case of a large Hindu temple, these murtis are made out of granite or marble. They are expected to endure for a long time. That ceremony will be done once, as long as the murti, does not decay or degenerate. Technically speaking, any murti can also be, if I use the word, deconsecrated in the same way that it is consecrated, but generally because of careful selection of the material out of which they are made, in the case of large temples, these murtis endure for centuries and beyond. Secondly, but we also have the phenomena all the time in India and other parts where murtis are created for very specific ritual occasions. So we have Durga Puja, for example. This is when the divine is worshipped as mother of the universe. And then special murtis are made. God as divine mother is invited to be present in this murti to receive worship for a specific time. In the case of Durga Puja, 9 days, at the end of which the divine is graciously thanked. The festival comes to an end. Murti is taken out in procession, which is what you mentioned, and immersed in a water source, in an ocean or a lake. Something similarly happens in the city of Mumbai during the time of the Ganesha festival, when God is worshipped in the form of Ganesh for a limited period of time. Murti is consecrated and deconsecrated, immersed in water. And the same may be happening in the home, but some homes do have murtis that are consecrated and made out of material that will endure. And these murtis are passed on from family to family. It's a sort of a precious legacy of the tradition of that family. Those murtis will endure. So generally speaking, I am affirming what you're saying. Yes, any murti can be deconsecrated if the circumstances warrant it, and the consecration and deconsecration, or the transitoriness, if I would put it, of the murti is something that happens all the time in the Hindu tradition, especially with festivals in the calendar that are for a particular period during the year. Does that make sense? I hope that I got to your question.
Anand, it makes sense, but I'll tell you where I find the limitations of it. And I'll tell the story. Where when we were in, only you weren't with us, but when I sat with Ravi Shankar and Subhanendra Tirtha Swamiji in Cordova, actually, in 2003, in a hotel room, and I asked them these questions, about the nature of image worship, they replied with a river answer. Now, if the river answer is only a function of or really relevant for idols or murtis made of clay, but the really important ones are made of durable materials, then we have one of two ways of saying. Either really the theory is that it's temporary, or the other way around. Hindus use the possibility of temporary images as an apology for murti, but there's something that's a little disingenuous about how Hindu apologetics works. That is to say, if there's really a significant quantitative aspect of temple and home murtis that really are not made on a temporary basis but are meant to endure, then the whole argument about the transitoriness, therefore showing awareness of God not being really fully identified, is weakened and becomes apologetic. Now, is that a fair critique or an unfair critique?
Well, I think it's also a more, I don't know how to put it. If you do not, if the worship ritual involves, if every time you went to worship a particular icon or murti, you had to perform the ceremony of inviting God to be present, then, which is a very elaborate and a very lengthy ceremonial process that runs for maybe a week or even more with all of its complex procedures. You would have to do that every day. So in the temples it is done once, and therefore God is invited to be present, and the rituals are performed until for some reason that murti is no longer a usable murti. Then there is a ritual process also of disposing of the murti. But the general principle of transitoriness, even though the murti endures for a very long time, no one would say that, you know, a murti cannot be desanctified or ritually disposed of. In the case of the festivals, you know, the ceremony is performed and then the murti is sacred for 9 days or 7 days, at the end of which the murti is then disposed of. So there is also a practical question of the ceremony itself.
Okay. Hello.
Hi.
You know, I've been listening to this conversation and thinking about having memories of my roommate who was a Hindu woman, and a friend who's a Sikh woman, and another friend who's Jain. And I'm thinking about how important, I've never been to India, but it seems really important, the artistic expression of spirituality in India. And I wonder how much of this conversation about murtis and icons and idols and images and all that is mostly an expression of love for God through the arts, and maybe not all cultures have that permission or artistic expression just to show their love for God and spirituality in this way. And I wonder if understanding this from an artistic and cultural perspective changes things in the conversation.
Annie, thank you very much for bringing this dimension to the discussion of icons, because you're absolutely right. In fact, those who make the murtis in the Hindu tradition, they are referred to as sacred artists, and they're called shilpis, which means a sacred artist. And so the murtis also, in addition to what I've spoken about, to the ritual use and purpose of the murtis, they are a deep expression as well of the artistic energies of the culture. And these murtis, when you look at them, yes, they are tremendous works of art, which is one of the reasons why museums are always interested in collecting and having murtis. They are such exquisitely made forms in proportion and finesse that one cannot but stand in admiration for the deep sacredness of that art as well. Every religious tradition brings its artistic energies, and that artistic energy finds expression in particular ways. In Islam, it finds expression in calligraphy, in the writing of the Quran, in the architecture of mosques. But yes, in the Hindu tradition, artistic energy also finds a special expression in the fashioning and making of murtis. So I say yes to all that to what you've asked me. Absolutely. Okay.
So I'm ready to move on.
No.
I wanted to ask a question that struck me, and it was a thought that I had when I was reading your piece, and I'm interested in hearing your point of view. And my question is about popular culture, popular religion, as opposed to sounds strange to say centralized religion after you've made it so clear that there is no real centralized religion. But I guess I'll give my analogy in my own culture, and then maybe you can explain if that has any relevance to Hinduism. In Judaism, we see people sometimes participating in rituals or ceremonial activities, or using amulets or signs that suggest that that they'll give protection or some of those things, and we say those are artifacts from a kind of populist religious perspective, but may not go directly. It may not stem from the kind of the core of Jewish practice. And in my circles, we tend to dismiss that kind of practice. Is there any comparable aspect of that within Hindu religion? And I even wondered if there might be a certain. Can you hear me? Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I just read it. I can like different on the way to
I'm down to my third phone.
Soon we'll go through all the phones in your house.
The phones the batteries don't seem to be going very fast. But anyway, we are at the end now. So yes, there is a lot of that phenomena in the Hindu tradition. Absolutely.
So the question I want
you spoke about amulets. It's very common for people to write sacred verses and keep, in small lockets wear around the neck or some part of the body. Generally speaking, you have different kinds of theological perspectives on these. You have said that tradition don't see these as going to the heart of the religion, and there are people like that in the Hindu tradition as well who would not give much significance or importance to these kinds of things in terms of what the religious life really is. But on the other hand, if it is an expression of a person's faith in God, a recognition of God, and if through this the person is able to develop a closer relationship with the divine, then no one frowns upon it. If it serves some religious value for the person, doesn't hurt anyone else, it's generally speaking, the tradition is comfortable with it.
My next question, and perhaps this is I have an intuition, but perhaps it's totally incorrect, which is that, and this maybe harkens back also to my first question with regard to leadership. Is there any way that sort of division between popular culture and, call it maybe philosophical religion, reflects also on the relationship between the gurus and the priests? I have the idea the priests represent popular religion and the gurus represent a sort of more philosophical, more insubstantial, not insubstantial, but unpersonified version.
Generally, you have articulated it well. I think I would say that's widely true, and therefore the sphere of the popular religion will also be the sphere of the ritual specialist in the widest sense. Yes, most of the gurus would be less directly involved in that kind of phenomena. If that's what your sense is, I think you are quite right in that feeling, that thought. Yes.
Would you have the situation where a guru would be less likely to participate in temple rites because of their more philosophical attitude, or do they also subscribe to the temple rites and the rites of the ritual part aspects of the religion?
They do. That's also good. Generally speaking, they themselves will not lead the temple rites or rituals. That's the sphere of the ritual specialist, but they may often be present. They may also often be present there if they are invited or if there's some special occasion. But generally speaking, with rare exceptions, they themselves do not lead or participate, in the same way that the temple or the priest specialist will do. But they are not antagonistic or they are not hostile to it. They understand its purpose. They recognize that it meets certain kinds of religious needs, and that people are growing, and eventually, hopefully, people will come to see the need for a deeper kind of wisdom and spirituality, and they are there when those moments arrive.
Thank you.
I think we are out of time. I got to run, Alan. It's now 12:50 your time, so can I say bye then?
Yeah, we clap for you. Warm clap.
Thank you. And
it's been very rich conversation. Thank you, Anand.
Thank you. Good to be with you, Alan. Good to be with all of you. Bye.
Bye, Anand. Thank you.